Go!
While stories have been around since the beginning of human history, different expressions of stories have evolved over the years. Painting, music, and theater have been there since the beginning. Literature has been around a long time too, and has gained much sophistication since the start of the written language. And although movies have only been around for about 100 years, film has gained much respect as an expressive medium. Enter video games, one of the newest forms of media. Having only reached mainstream popularity since the 1970s, video games are still in their infancy. Still being untested, there are many questions not yet answered about this medium, and one of the most contentious is the question, are video games art? One of the most memorable detractors is the late Roger Ebert, who said, "To my knowledge, no one in or out of the field has been able to cite a game worthy of comparison with the great dramatists, poets, filmmakers, novelists, and composers." But for most gamers, video games represent a loss of those precious hours we have available to make ourselves more cultured, civilized, and empathetic. To be sure, literature has had hundreds, if not thousands of years to develop its Pride and Prejudices, its Hamlets, its Crime and Punishments, and countless other classics. You could try to defend video games by saying they have to rely on computers, which are equally new and untested. However, I would point to how video games are an outgrowth of games in general. But games themselves have largely been informal and undeveloped until the rise of the middle class, which rose literacy rates and leisure time enough to make the formalization of rules for widespread and well-developed games to be viable. Compare this to film, which has also been a fairly recent invention, but is an outgrowth of theater, which has been around for thousands of years. Thus, many have doubts, looking for video games to prove their worth. Detractors will say video games are not art, that they are trivial and a waste of time. These objectors will often point to many popular games of today. After all, everyone knows a certain number of greats from literature, like A Tale of Two Cities or Alice in Wonderland, but what video games are well known by everybody? Pac-Man, Mario, and Angry Birds are perhaps the only video game icons that are widely known even to non-gamers. But these games hardly convey a sense that the medium imparts any depth. Indeed, much of gaming history was dominated by the popular notion that games are for children. Mere sensory entertainment. Games have sometimes been synonymous with toys. However, as gamers have grown up, many games have shifted their subject matter to reflect this change in the market. Yet, the popular titles of today hardly do the gamer's argument much good. Call of Duty dominates the market, as does similarly M-rated games. And although they contain more adult content such as violence and sex, they hardly seem any deeper than their Angry Birds counterparts. Indeed, perhaps part of the confusion surrounding how sophisticated games can be comes from the ambiguity of the word mature in the context of video games. Many of the most popular games today are rated M for mature, but what does that actually mean? The Entertainment Software Rating Board, or ESRB, is the organization that rates video games in order to suggest how age-appropriate a certain game is, with the mature rating meaning that the game is for 17 and up. However, I believe this rating system creates a confusion of language, and we should keep in mind that there are often two ways of using the word mature when talking about gaming culture and the gaming industry. I will distinguish these two types of maturity with the following term: surface maturity. Surface maturity is a surface-level, shallow reading of maturity, which simply deems the material as inappropriate for children. That is to say, if it ain't for kids, then it must be for adults. This is often categorized by language, violence, gore, and sex. And this kind of maturity is what the ESRB uses to evaluate their ratings. Deeper maturity. Deeper maturity is a kind of maturity that goes beyond the aforementioned surface elements. It's hard to exactly put into words what being mature really means, but it has to do with an understanding of the world as a complex place of knowing that often there are no easy answers, and of a willingness to listen to others and their ideas. One instance of deeper maturity, a subcategorization, might be called narrative maturity. And a story that displays narrative maturity is able to locate itself in an intertextual web of art and literature. This kind of maturity asks the audience to have a high level of familiarity with other texts. That is, asking the reader to be well-read or well-informed. Another instance, another subcategory, might be called moral maturity. A piece of media that displays moral maturity uses its complexities to mirror the complexities and ambiguities of real-world ethical problems and dilemmas. Now, don't misunderstand me when I separate these two ideas out. Don't think I'm saying one of these two presentations of maturity in video games is inherently better than the other. It might sound like I'm writing off surface maturity as shallow and artless, but I think it has its place. Language, sex, and especially violence can be fun, or given a unique visual flair to it, or can be fascinating in its mere excessiveness. It can all be quite engaging in a puerile sort of way. Surface maturity can be entertaining, even if it's not high art. However, I do think it is important to make this distinction that these two types of maturity are quite different from one another. Indeed, think of our everyday sense of the word mature. If you were to describe someone as mature, would you really be saying that he's really violent, uses profane language, or has sex all the time? Because that's how some video games, especially the popular ones, seem to describe themselves. Thus, when detractors see a game that is rated as mature, they often see a game that is very juvenile, parading around with an adult subject matter without an adult understanding of the material. The questions are then raised. Can a video game reach a deeper level of maturity? Can a game use adult subject matter in a manner that is truly mature? Or are video games simply trivial and juvenile by definition? Or perhaps as a requirement by design? Perhaps the best way to answer this question is to see if there is at least one example of a video game capable of achieving something deeper, something more meaningful than visceral entertainment. For if at least one game can rise up to this standard, it shows that it is not impossible for games to have depth. To this end, I introduce you to The Wolf Among Us. The Wolf Among Us is an episodic adventure game by Telltale Games. This title draws on various fairy tales and folklore, and presents the characters from those old stories in the modern world, 1980s New York specifically. You play as Bigby, also known as the Big Bad Wolf. Yes, that Big Bad Wolf, the one from Little Red Riding Hood. While being fun and having a compelling narrative, I believe The Wolf Among Us exemplifies how video games can display both surface-level maturity and a deeper reading of maturity. But to prove that point, I'll need to explain three big things about The Wolf Among Us. Number 1, the story. The premise for this story is that long ago, in a place that is simply referred to as the Homelands, the characters from the old stories and the fairy tales were real. These characters, called fables, living unnaturally long lives, having never physically aged and being incredibly difficult to kill, lived away from the mundane, normal mortals of this world, or Mundies. But as the mundane world industrialized and overtook the homelands, the fables were forced out of their homes and into a ghetto called Fabletown in New York City. To continue to hide from the Mundies, the fables use a magic called glamour to appear human. However, the glamour is expensive, and not all residents can afford to pay. With economic woes comes social unrest and criminal activity. Enter the protagonist and player character, Bigby, aka the Big Bad Wolf, who has been appointed as the sheriff of Fabletown in order to keep the peace and serve the public good. Despite working to preserve the peace, many characters resent Bigby, both for his past actions as the villainous big bad wolf, but also as a representative of the local government failing to protect and serve many of its citizens. Yet, he is the sheriff, and when Fabletown's first murder in years is left on his doorstep, Bigby must investigate and interrogate his way through the community in order to get to the bottom of this grisly crime. Number 2. The characters. Along the way, you'll meet a variety of characters straight out of several well-known stories and fairy tales. This includes the deputy mayor, Ichabod Crane, who originates from the legend of Sleepy Hollow and is often rude, impatient, and abrasive towards other characters.
The last thing I need with Mayor Cole away is a hysteria. Do you understand me?
Yes, of course I do.
Don't interrupt me, Miss Snow.
You asked me a question.
Don't change the subject. You are to blame for this unpleasantness, Miss Snow.
You'll also meet the Woodsman from Bigby's own tale of Little Red Riding Hood. He's hit rock bottom since then, and is one of the persons of interest in your investigation. There's also a subplot dealing with the marital life of Beauty and the Beast, who seem to be slowly drifting apart.
Please, Bigby. Promise me you won't tell Beast you saw me. He worries too much as it is, and it would just make my life a lot easier.
Additionally, there are trolls, mermaids, flying monkeys a la Wizard of Oz, and more, whom you'll meet in your adventures through Fabletown. However, one of the more interesting characters, and the only one trying to help Bigby's investigation, is Snow White. If you don't know the story, an evil queen tried to use a poison apple to kill Snow White out of jealousy for her beauty, but instead of being killed, Snow White fell asleep until a prince woke her up with a kiss and rescued her away. However, the modern Snow White has left her prince and is working as a secretary for the mayor. She resents having so little control and demands to be included in Bigby's investigation. This is perhaps a rebellion against the stereotypical idea of fairy tale princesses as powerless and passive. Rather than waiting to be rescued, Snow White is actively trying to reform the local government and help the other residents of Fabletown. This revision of Snow White's character is an interpretation of how these old story figures would react to modern times. Indeed, much of The Wolf Among Us is very aware of the origins of these characters, as shown by the fact that the catalog for all fables used by Bigby to identify his victim is actually a picture book. This is one of several ways that the video game points to the source material being popularly seen as stories for children. Another two characters you'll meet, and perhaps the greatest contrast between this video game and the stories from which this game draws from, is found in that of Toad and TJ. Toad is originally a character from the book The Wind in the Willows. Toad is reacting to modern times much less positively than Snow White. Cursing and foul-mouthed, he dislikes Bigby, but what's more, his greatest departure from his portrayal in Kenneth Graham's novel is in how he treats his son, Toad Jr., or TJ for short. He yells at his son in no less harsh language and often subjects him to hard environments.
Furry prick job shite. Tell me how to spend my money.
Dad, the lights are shaking again.
What did I say? You want a big bad wolf to take you away?
No.
Then get the fuck back inside!
It is still clear that Toad loves his son, but his rude nature leaves much to be desired. It would appear that the designers, by subjecting TJ to several rough situations, acts as a sign to the audience that this is no place for children by showing just how out of place a child is in this world. Frightened of the violence around him and subjected to the foul nature of his father, TJ, as the only child in the game, displays how adult the game is, how inappropriate for children the events of this game are. By showing these characters in such a high level of contrast from their original works, The Wolf Among Us is able to locate itself within an intertextual web. In order to get the references and to understand the nuance of the characters, the player must be familiar with the origins of these characters. This is the very definition I put forth of narrative maturity, a subcategory of deeper maturity. Yet, for all the complexity the narrative and characters show, it all hangs on a fairly simple interactive framework. That is, Number 3. The mechanics. The Wolf Among Us is an adventure game, and as an adventure game, you have the ability to walk Bigby around to search for clues or to explore the environment. Many objects can be interacted with or stored for later use. Additionally, dialogue options allow you to choose how the sheriff responds to various denizens. How do you react? Are you mean and nasty, or rough but kind-hearted, or flippant and dismissive? The other characters will react differently based on your responses, and pop-up hints remind you that the characters will remember what you say and do.
So, you were planning on robbing her?
Yeah, her and her grandma.
Grandma? Wait, what are you talking about?
Red Riding Hood, her grandmother. I was there to rob them. But when I showed up, you were already there, lying in the bed. I only saved her because I thought she might give me a reward. But she didn't give me shit. Except a bunch of people thinking I'm something I ain't. I played along as I could. Only thing I managed to get from it was a free drink every now and again. Not a good that did.
Did you kill Faith?
What? Faith? Who's
The
that?
girl you were beating on this morning.
No. I was here. I swear.
Doesn't look good when a girl you were just smacking around shows up dead hours later.
I played along as I could. Only thing I managed to get from it was a free drink every now and again. Not a good that did.
I'm dragging you back to the woodland.
For what? Jesus, Bigby, that fucking hurt.
Wasting my fucking time.
This all goes towards making the player feel as though they have a lot of choice and control as to what direction the game takes. Lastly, there are fights which implement quick-time events, where pushing the right buttons will allow you to dodge or attack. These bits of violence are fairly short and unchallenging, but are interspersed well with the slower investigation and interrogation bits to quicken the pace and to highlight the brutish nature of this world of Fabletown. All of these elements, story, characters, and mechanics combine to make a compelling game, which allows me to lead into my larger topic concerning maturity and how it's perceived in relation to video games. As a video game, The Wolf Among Us presents an interesting shift in the way the medium is viewed. Originally, video games were popularly conceived as toys meant only for children, much as the very fairy tales that The Wolf Among Us draws on were viewed as mere stories for children. Indeed, there are many parallels that can be raised between video games and fairy tales. The main one that this video will be focusing on is that they were both publicly viewed as artless, unable to achieve a deeper meaning, and useful only for entertaining children. Though fairy tales might still be chained to this public opinion, video games have somewhat changed their image as a larger percentage of adults are self-proclaimed gamers. Yet, there is still much reluctance in the cultural mindset to see video games as something more. Though many of the biggest selling games are aimed at young adults, there are many people who still think of video games as artless, as mere sensory stimulation without nuance or meaning. And although many adults play these games, detractors will call these gamers just as puerile as children. Part of the criticism lies in the fact that although a game might have adult content, that does not make the game any less childish or immature. While I would agree that there are many games that use surface maturity without depth, I think these detractors ignore many instances of games that do achieve a deeper sense of maturity. The Wolf Among Us is one of those games that is able to demonstrate both kinds of maturity. Within the game, there are several instances of violence. Axes to the head, fistfights, decapitations, and gouging eyes, if I'm to sum it up. Additionally, the game brings in sex and language, one scene even taking place in a strip club. These are definite cases of surface maturity, and if the game provided no additional context or deeper meaning, this use of violence, language, or sex would fail to reach a deeper level of maturity, as these elements alone do not carry depth. To further clarify, in contemporary culture at large, including video games and other media, there seems to be a conditioning in audiences that if something is unsuitable for children, then it must be appealing to adults. Many video games and movies use blood, gore, and sex to appeal to older audiences as if saying, now that you're old enough, you get to see this stuff. This is a superficial reading of both the dichotomy between children and adults and a failure to understand why violence and sex could be used to be engaging. Indeed, having violence or other adult content simply to thrill reminds me of a child in a sandbox throwing their action figures around and making explosion sounds. It may be fun, heck, it might be a blast, but it doesn't seem all that mature. But this superficial reading of surface elements is not just limited to adult audiences. Fairy tales themselves are pigeonholed as stories for children, yet historically speaking, this is not the audience for fairy tales. Originally, many of these tales were told by adults for adults. Indeed, the Brothers Grimm, through whom many of these tales became famous, had to edit many later editions of their work to make the stories more appropriate for children and for Christian sensibilities. The public perception of these tales shifted when children became the primary audience of these stories. As such, many of these stories have been sanitized over time. The premarital sex in Rapunzel, the anti-Semitism in The Jew and the Brambles, the graphic violence in The Robber Bridegroom were all either toned down or eliminated completely from most modern versions. This is the inverse of what's happening to video games. To fairy tales, because they're for children, it mustn't have adult material. Thus, much of the elements of surface maturity have been wiped from modern retellings. But let us not think that The Wolf Among Us is nothing but a vapid mess of sex, language, and violence. While all those do appear, I am going to argue that this game is able to achieve deeper maturity, or an underlying meaning that acknowledges the complexity of the world that requires a more nuanced appreciation from the player. Perhaps the best example I can pull to demonstrate this deeper maturity is the moral choice aspect of this game. Nowadays, many games have implemented a moral choice mechanic to their game, like in the Infamous series, which delineates many choices as good or evil, using a blue and red bar to indicate your current goodness or evilness levels. And certain events award you points to move up or down this spectrum. For example, you can heal your fellow citizens or murder them. Unless you yourself are a sociopath, you could probably guess which is the good option and which is the evil one. Yes, much of the Infamous series has you doing either obviously heroic deeds, like rescuing hostages, or ridiculously evil deeds, like killing cops. This type of moral choice system is so clearly telegraphed to the player that there is never a point where the player is asked to grapple with the gray area of right and wrong. As players, you are never in doubt of what the right or wrong thing to do is, and unless you really are a sociopath, or you have an unrelenting, unbendable moral code, I would argue this black and white presentation of morality is far removed from the morality we wrestle with every day. You might, in real life, struggle with the choice to help people or not, for example, helping a homeless man on your street. Or a person might struggle with slipping into the temptation of doing a criminal act or not, for example, stealing. However, I seriously doubt that someone thinks, should I help this person, or should I murder them? Should I give food to the needy, or should I murder them? Should I heal this poor, helpless bystander, or should I consume his very life force from out of his face? This thought process does not reflect how I think about right and wrong in my everyday life, and the Infamous series falls short to talk about serious issues regarding ethics. Contrast this with the moral choices in The Wolf Among Us. Unlike Infamous, you do not have a morality bar that goes up or down according to your actions. The only guidelines you have to your actions are the reactions of the other characters, the consequences of your actions, and your own conscience. To illustrate, there is a moment early on where you find a prostitute who was beaten up by a patron who couldn't pay. It's implied that the girl will be punished by her pimp if she returns empty-handed. You have the option to hand over all of your money to potentially save the girl from another beating. The drawback is, you don't know if you'll need that money later or not.
How much was it he owed you?
100.
I'm guessing it'd be bad for you to show up empty-handed.
I'll be fine.
In this event, the player is dropped into a moral dilemma. Instead of consulting what the designer thinks is good or evil, like in the Infamous games, the player will have to rely on their own values and judgments, just like in real life. Almost every scene has a moral choice similar to this one. Do you take the wife's or the husband's side in a marital dispute?
Bigby, hey, wait up. Have you seen my wife? Have you seen Beauty?
Do you try to keep Snow White safe despite her insistence to tag along on a dangerous mission? Do you use force or persuasion to get information out of a witness? These are all weighty questions with no easy answers. I believe it's in these choices that The Wolf Among Us shines, allowing for depth and critical thinking. This moral choice mechanic acknowledges the complexity of a world in a way that only a video game can do. Rather than passively informing a reader or viewer of value systems or moral dilemmas, this game confronts the player with these questions head-on and asks them to decide for themselves. What's more, while other, less mature media would use sex and gore to show their own juvenile nature, The Wolf Among Us uses it to reinforce their moral choice mechanic. Because we have such ingrained attitudes about violence and sex, they make moral choices concerning those topics more weighty. Because violence is presented as an option for Bigby, we as players bring in our preconceived notions about violence which determine whether we use it.
He's had enough!
And as sex is such a sensitive subject, how you act towards the victims and perpetrators of sexual abuse will mostly depend on your outlook on the subject. By exploring the moral weight and complexities, The Wolf Among Us is able to achieve a greater, deeper level of maturity on these topics than many other games, and even other types of media. But lest you think I'm overreading into the complexity of this game, after the end of each episode, The Wolf Among Us provides statistics of how many players made the same choices you did. If the choices had obvious right or wrong answers, players would tend towards 100% of one choice and 0% of another. Or if players weren't engaging with the moral complexities and were making their choices randomly, then players would tend toward 50% of both choices. But neither is the case. In the dilemma regarding the prostitute, 67% of players gave her the money. This shows that there is a shared value of empathy across many but not all players. This demonstrates that players are actively engaging with the moral choices that are being presented in a more explicit and provocative manner than even in much of passive media.
You got me out of a bad situation back there. Thanks.
Therefore, by using a complex moral choice mechanic to mirror the complexities of real-world ethical quandaries by engaging the player to think critically about right and wrong, I believe this game is able to demonstrate moral maturity. Between the moral maturity of player choices and the narrative maturity of the story and characters, The Wolf Among Us is able to display a deeper level of maturity. And if The Wolf Among Us is able to reach this level of depth, it shows that it is not impossible for games as a whole to show depth. Perhaps a demonstration of depth or maturity is not enough to prove to everyone that games are art. But hopefully it is enough to show that games do not have to be trivial, that they can be meaningful. I use this example of The Wolf Among Us, and many other players cite other examples of games that are deep, enriching, touching, and meaningful, as we gamers are interested in seeing video games legitimized as an artistic medium. To us, it seems obvious that games are art, but why do so many others doubt it? Turning to Roger Ebert, another quote by him represents a possible explanation. Games, as a medium, seem to be fundamentally misunderstood by many non-gamers. which is understandable when, for many people, the only experience they have with games is rock, paper, scissors, Monopoly, Pac-Man, and Angry Birds. Ebert, and many others who have this limited experience of games, assumes that games are, by definition, about winning and losing. But that's not true. Games are ultimately about doing. While in books or movies you read or watch someone else doing things, in games you are the doer. People play games to take up agency, to do things themselves, to explore, to overcome challenges, to shape their own story, to express themselves, or to take up a role that is completely foreign to them. This is the unlimited potential of games. This is the reason we play. These aesthetics, which have moved and challenged us. Despite what the detractors may say, we know it is worthwhile.